So I thought that I'd talk a little bit about the Sakya tradition and its path of practice to outline the main features and distinctiveness of this of our tradition's system of spiritual practice. Actually, of course, the thing to say is that there's no one size fits all, even within this particular tradition. Same with the other traditions of Dharma too. That it's very much a matter of how it works out for you as an individual, in terms of how the lamas that you meet, the particular suggestions they have for your practice, your strengths, your weaknesses, even. And just conditions arising in terms of what teachings you can meet and what practices you can do. So there's no one monolithic system of practice, especially as the essence of practice, or the essence of practice is simply the discovery of the true nature of one's mind. And there couldn't be anything more intimate or personal, of course, than this. So it's not what follows is not in any way saying this is the absolutely one way to practice or to study, even within the Sakya tradition. So it's like a kind of general. It's like saying it generally goes like this, but it can vary. So as long as you understand that it might be helpful what I say, what I kind of the map I sketch out, so to speak. So the first thing to say is really that the path of practice is twofold, in the sense that you need to be able to balance and to weave together throughout your Dharma life of practice two elements. One from the kind of teaching side, receiving the teachings and contemplating them, and the other from the practice in terms of, what one might say really the meditation side of things. They support each other. In the teaching side provides the intellectual confidence that we then can bring to our meditation and apply the instructions, knowing why they work, even though we have not tasted the experience of the practice ourselves yet. And another way of looking at it is that the teachings are like the map, and the practice actually is traveling over that terrain, over that territory. But without the map, you're going to be traveling blind, and so it's very unlikely that you'll achieve what you aim to do, what you aim to achieve. So in Sakya, the teachings, on the teaching side, of course, really, a source of them, as with the practice side, is the Buddha's own original instructions. But what I would say is that in Sakya, perhaps the most approachable presentation of the teachings for beginners is what is found in the work called Elucidating or Clarifying the Thought of the Sage, composed by the great Sakyapandita way back in the 13th century. It's what might be called, in a more general Tibetan Buddhist sense, a lamrim text, a text setting out the stages of the path, from the level of a beginner, somebody just encountering Dharma for the first time, because the Dharma speaks in some way to their Buddha nature, and going through everything from taking refuge to generating bodhicitta, practicing the six perfections, and so on. So it's a lamrim text. It doesn't actually include Vajrayana in it, but it's lamrim text like that, and it's based upon the classical works of Indian Mahayana. That would be one kind of good foundation for embarking on the life of practice, if we're able to hear from our lamas and study the Tupigongsa, the elucidating the thought of the sage. Beyond that, deeper than that, or kind of led on to from that, would be the great subjects, as we call them, the great 6 subjects that make up the syllabus, if we're to become learned, practitioners, learned Dharma people. So that would mean receiving teachings on the paramita, the perfection teachings, like Shantideva's Bodhicharvatara, entering the path of a bodhisattva, the Jude Lama and so on, the works of Maitreya, all that comprises the parameters, and then there's the Abhidharma teachings discussing the the different analysis of phenomena. And then if you're a monastic, you would study the Vinaya, but if you're not a monastic, it's not really necessary, of course, or relevant to your Dharma life. And then beyond that, there's the pramana. Pramana means the texts, the teachings on logical reasoning and epistemology. They're very supportive, especially if we want to engage in it, and later we're trying to expound the teachings. The teachings on logic will come in very useful. There's the Madhyamaka, the middle way teachings on the correct view. And finally, there's teachings dealing with the topics of the Tantras, not expounding the methods of practice so much, but explaining the correct understanding of what the Tantras teach. So texts like Sapan's Domsum, discriminating the three vows, or Sonasemo's general presentation of the Tantra sets. So that's, in a way, the intellectual, the study side syllabus of things. And we will maybe not be able to receive all of it, or maybe you're not even inclined to receive all of it, but some of it at least, particularly, like I said, Sapan's Tripagonsal, elucidating the thought of sage, will be very, very helpful. Now, to deal with the practice side of things, I'll do that much more extensively today. Really, where do we begin? Well, most usually in Sakya, we begin by hearing and then reflecting on the teachings that comprise the cycle known as Shempishibdal, or separating from the four attachments, or parting from the four attachments. This is a system of practice that goes back to Sachen Kungin Rinpo, the first of the great Sakya masters. Well, actually, it came to him in a vision of Manjushri. But the Shempishibdal is a teaching that anybody with very little knowledge, you can relate to this teaching, because it starts in a way just where you are as a beginner. But at the same time, it presents a step-by-step approach. So initially in this teaching, one would hear and meditate. Meditate here means reflect on the four thoughts that turn the mind to Dharma. And that way, to free ourselves from the kind of more gross attachments, like attachment to the things of this life, and then beyond the more subtle attachment to rebirth, attachment to samsara. And then on the basis of that, having developed that kind of strength of purpose and mind, then one is introduced to the bodhicitta practices, loving kindness, compassion, bodhicitta. And then finally one meditates on the view of the Madhyamaka view, realizing the nature of reality is beyond all extremes, through practicing calm abiding and insight meditation. So more or less every beginner in the Sakya tradition will be given these teachings, will encounter these teachings and put them into practice in varying ways. But also in the Sakya tradition, it's usually very common for, relatively speaking, beginners to, if they receive the appropriate initiations and teachings, to meditate on one of the deities, one of the embodiments of qualities of enlightenment, like, for instance, the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who we regard as the embodiment of transcendental wisdom. And in a way, Manjushri is like the patron of the entire Sakya tradition. So it's very common for meditators to receive his initiation and then set about accomplishing the practice, possibly by short retreat, or at least trying to practice it regularly, until they gain some of the qualities of Manjushri's wisdom. And that would be by practicing the sadhana, the meditation of Manjushri, with the visualizations, the mantra recitations, and so on. Again, at the same kind of fairly introductory Vajrayana level, one might well practice some meditation on Chenrezig, who in a way is kind of like one of the chief bodhisattvas of the Mahayana, and in the Vajrayana represents the compassion of all the Buddhas. Or the female deity, Tara, again an embodiment of the compassion of all the Buddhas. These are typical type of practices one might do as somebody who's kind of fairly new, but serious about practicing. If you're serious about practicing, this is probably what you'd be doing, you'd be introduced to and you'd be doing in your first few years in Dharma practice. And for some people, that would be enough. That kind of basic teaching on the parting from the four attachments, where you, if you like, you develop the appropriate Dharma values of renunciation and compassion and understanding, and the more experiential practices of the deities like Manjushri and Chenrezig. For many, that would form a lifetime's practice. But if one wishes in the Sakya tradition to get to, as it were, engage with the how to say, more powerfully transformative, more rapidly transformative practice, because actually any practice can lead you more or less all the way in Vajrayana. But if you want to engage in the more powerful transformative practices, then of Vajrayana, then instead of, if you meditate in one of these deities I mentioned, which belong to the Kriya Tantra or Charya Tantra, the two lower tantras, you might well practice, you've gone to practice a deity that belongs to the Anuttara, Supreme Yoga class of practices. So in Sakya, that kind of level of practice might well begin with practicing the sadhana, the meditation, on the Bodhisattva Vajrapani. But in the Tantras, there are many different initiations and lines of Vajrapani practice. Vajrapani represents or embodies the power of all the Buddhas, power in the sense of the force of compassion and wisdom that overcomes all obstacles. So in Sakya, we particularly like to meditate on a form of Vajrapani known as Bhuta Dhammara, subduer of all the elemental spirits. Of course, the real elemental spirits are our own disturbing emotions. We may project them outside in the form of hostile beings, but the real ones are, of course, nowhere else other than our own heart or our own mind. But to engage in the very most subtle and powerful Vajrayana practices is usual to as a precursor to that, as in almost like a kind of equipping ourselves with the ability to withstand any obstacles that might arise from powerful practice, which can happen. We'd practice Vajrapani. We'd receive the initiation of Vajrapani and do that meditation. The initiation, of course, comes, like all practices, all initiations, from a lineage. In this case, is a practice that was brought to Tibet by the great Master Bhai Lotsawa, and then maintained in our Sakya tradition. So Vajrapani Bhuta Dhamma would be quite an important practice if one was going to go into the higher levels of Vajrayana practice. One might do up to a month's retreat, intensive meditation on that deity. And that then leads us to the kind of core higher Vajrayana practices in Sakya, the ones that are in a way like the most prized, most treasured teachings of Sakya. And these, although one sometimes says, well, there are 5 main tantric cycles in Sakya, actually in a way we can reduce them to two main cycles of advanced Vajrayana. Though that cycle of practice that's connected with the goddess, the enlightened female Buddha, Vajrayogini, and that level of practice associated with the deity Hevajra or Gepadoji in Tibetan. Both of these come from, of course, from Anuttara Tantras. Vajrayogini, the goddess Vajrayogini, her practice comes from the Chakasamvara Tantra. And Hevajra, well, the Vajra practice, the deity Hevajra, of course, comes from the Pulmonist Tantra, the Hevajra Tantra. Well, there are 3 versions of it, but it comes from that Hevajra cycle. So, as with all Vajrayana practices, and particularly the highest level, then one cannot really talk about such the real nitty-gritty, the real details of practice in a public forum, because there's a certain reserve that should be maintained in regard to such things, especially because people will not have received the appropriate initiations that allow you entry into those practices. So all one can do is explain their part, the part they play in the overall Sakya scheme of things. So to do that, let me say this. The practices of the path that I've mentioned so far, they are, the Shempajidral, that teachings, parted from the four attachments, it's a distillation of teachings from the common Dharma, the sutra teachings of both the Hinayana, the lesser vehicle, and the Mahayana, the greater vehicle. But those teachings, that common approach is sequential, step-by-step method of accumulating the good qualities of compassion and wisdom and dispelling the obstacles caused by our negative actions and so on, disturbing emotions. But there's step-by-step growth, as if we start from a place of unknowing as a total beginner and gradually want to collect the qualities that will finally add up to Buddhahood. That is the method of and the perspective of common Dharma. But in the Vajrayana is uncommon Dharma. And the meaning of that is the whole Vajrayana perspective, the whole Vajrayana take on things is very different. And the Vajrayana take on things, as explained in the Tantra as well, like it says in Vajra Tantra, all beings are already Buddhas, but simply do not know that due to the obscurations. But once those obscurations, the fog, if you like, that covers our Buddha nature mind is removed, then the natural purity of the mind and its possession of the qualities of enlightenment, its potential for compassion and wisdom is revealed. And so that potential can quickly come to fruition because the coverings have been removed. So instead of it being a journey, instead of the spiritual path being a journey from unknowingness now, with no qualities, to some place in the future of knowing and with qualities, the state of knowingness in a way, the state of enlightenment in a way, is within us. Not that we're functioning Buddhas now, not that we can do whatever we like and there's no consequences, or we possess all the qualities of enlightened being functionally. We don't. They're like a seed. But that seed has all, just as a seed has all the genetic potential to become, well, whatever it is, a rice stalk or an oak tree or whatever. So we have all the, so to speak, genetic potential, our mind does at least, to be a fully functioning Buddha. And the Vajrayana takes that as its underlying principle. So even the lower Tantra practices that we present and teach and practice often in Sakya, like Manjushri practice or Tara or Chenrezig and so on, they are based on that fundamental principle that the Buddha nature is within, or the nature of our mind is primordially pure. And initiation is a means of connecting us with that through the medium of the deity. The deity is not an independent person or something out there. The deity is in a way like a reflection of the purity of your mind. And by using that means of visualization and mantra recitation and meditation introduced to you in the initiation, you can, as it were, cultivate a relationship with your natural state of mind so that the qualities of that start to irradiate your life. You become more like Manjushri, you become more like Chenrezig, you become more like Tara, etc. So it's a radically different way of practicing and of understanding the spiritual path when you practice Vajrayana. But those lower Tantra practices, from the Kriya or Charya Tantra practices, they still won't take you all the way. They'll take you a long way, but we don't think they'll take you all the way to Buddhahood if that's all you practiced in this life. For the practices that allow enlightenment, but they give you the opportunity to achieve total fulfillment in this life as a Buddha, then you need the Anuttara, the Supreme Yoga practices, because they have the methods that transform the experiences, the most kind of, fundamental experiences of samsara, birth and death, for which for us are matters of extraordinary confusion and fear, and the hallmarks of samsaric suffering, etc. The Supreme Yoga Tantra practices is sort of in their technology, if I can use it, with their spiritual technology, enables us to refigure those experiences, to approach them now while in life and transform them so that they become, in a way, where we find nirvana instead of samsara. It's like birth and death and the intermediate state from which we pass from one to the other, they are the kind of most fundamental, elemental manifestations of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, cycle of suffering. But they actually are empty. They're empty of any intrinsic nature. If we could actually realize their nature, they would be the display of nirvana. Or in tantric terms, they would be the development stage in which we arise as a deity, and the completion stage in which, as a deity, we then dissolve into the unconditioned clear light of emptiness. That's birth and death, experienced as a Buddha experiences them. Boundlessness and clarity, emptiness and clarity, nothing more than the natural state of mind, which has always been there, because our mind is beyond birth and death. It has no beginning, no end, and yet at the same time, it is clear and aware. So that nature of mind is what we can discover and use as our vehicle to enlightenment, to Buddhahood, in the Anuttara Yoga practices. So like I say, in our Sakya tradition, we have two major cycles that are most commonly practiced. One is the cycle associated with the goddess Vajrayogini. So that practice, of course, as I mentioned earlier, its template is found in the Chakkasamvara Tantra. Actually, there's 3 or 4 different cycles of Chakkasamvara, but it's found in them. You found in those different Chakkasamvara Tantras, because there Buddhahood is presented as in the form of the deity, the male deity Chakkasamvara and female consort Vajrayogini. Does that mean that it's Mr. and Mrs. Buddha? No. For Buddhahood, enlightenment, of course, is the dissolution of all dualities. It's the dissolution of the duality of birth and death, of compassion and wisdom, of clarity and emptiness, and of course of male and female. So in the Chakkasamvara Tantra, Buddhahood is presented in this way, as the union of the male, Chakkasamvara, and the female, Vajrayogini. But if we practice the Vajrayogini, the female aspect of this, actually we will gain all the qualities of both aspects, of the father and the mother, as we would call them in the tantric system. So as the origin is therefore in the Chakkasamvara Tantra, but as with all the tantras, the way the practice is developed is their template is found in the tantras, but later yogins and yoginis, later practitioners, who are of course extremely far along the path, would, so to speak, have encounters with the tantric deities. I don't mean they met them as real people. The deities are not separate ontologically deities, people like that. Their reflections are nature of mind, but they would meet those, so to speak. And in this case, for instance, Vajrayogini, different yogins in India, different siddhas, would have visionary experiences of Vajrayogini as a result of their meditation. And she would manifest in different ways to them, perhaps slightly different form of visual appearance, perhaps the mantra would be slightly different. And the techniques of meditation, therefore, for cultivating Vajrayogini, realizing your Vajrayogini nature, so to speak, which is what a sadhana is about, would evolve. So in Sakya, for instance, we have 3 major forms of Vajrayogini practice. But then out of those 3, which is associated with a different siddha. The siddha, the great Indian yogin Naropa, great Indian yogin Maitripa, and the great Indian yogin Indrabhuti. But the one we prefer most, or that's become most popular in terms of practice, is that Vajrayogini associated with the siddha Narotapa, or as some people call it, Naropa. So we call this form Naro Kachoma, Naro, the space traveler of Naro. Space travel is an English translation of the Sanskrit word Dakini, Tibetan Kandroma, and that's the name of the enlightened goddess in this system. So Vajrayogini, according to Naropa, is one of our 2 most famous and powerful cycles of practice. Of course, for this you have to receive the initiation and the blessing of Vajrayogini, and all the reading transmissions for her sadhanas and for the commentaries. So it's quite a lot to receive before one can even embark upon the practice. And especially because the practice of Vajrayogini is said to have, of Naropa's Vajrayogini anyway, is said to have 11 different yogas within it. 3 yogas for transforming daily life, 8 yogas to be practiced, as it were, on the meditation cushion. But the essence of those practices is twofold. One, the development stage, where we transform our perception of ourselves as ordinary beings into that of being Vajrayogini itself, through visualization and then through the recitation of the mantra being the way to, as it were, invoke the power and transformative power of the deity. So that is the development stage of Vajrayogini. And then for the completion stage, we practice certain kinds of yogas, certain types of yogas of the subtle body, because in the advanced Vajrayana, we understand that actually the Buddha's, in a way, or the enlightenment, just as in the ordinary teachings it says the Buddha nature is within you because the nature of your mind has got potential for Buddhahood. In the Vajrayana we say, or in the Anuttara at least, I should say, the highest level of Tantra, we say the Buddhas are fully developed already within your body. They're fully present. You misunderstand the nature of your body. You misunderstand the nature of your of the energies within your body. They're actually the energies of enlightenment already within you, but so to speak, frozen. Just as our mind is frozen into dualistic concepts and emotions, so the energies within our body, which are the energies of mind itself, are frozen, and one unfreezes them through the subtle body yogas or the completion stage yogas, and they're part of the whole Vajrayogini cycle. So through Vajrayogini, then, if we learn and practice those meditations, do the retreats, in which we have to accomplish large numbers of mantra recitations and so on, then it is possible to achieve Buddhahood in this life. And even in this past century, there have been certain yogins and yoginis of the Sakya tradition who have actually fully realized Vajrayogini. So this is one of the 2 main cycles of practice, and it is very, very, very popular among Sakya yogins. And the other is the cycle of practice associated with the deity Hevajra. In a way, this is an even bigger system than that of Vajrayogini. It's also bigger in terms of the material. Also, the actual meditation it takes longer to accomplish as well. Hevajra is, as I said, is the name of the deity, the symbolic Buddha form to be practiced, but it's the name of the source text, which is the Tantra, the Hevajra Tantra. Actually, as I mentioned again, there are 3 of them, but a root Tantra and 2 accompanying explanatory Tantras of Hevajra exist. And Hevajra's practice is kind of derived, the template for the practice, for the initiation, for the meditation, and so on, is found in those 3 Tantras. And quite a lot of different lineages or lines of Hevajra practice actually came from those Tantras, and they exist also outside the Sakya school. Mapa, one of the founders of the Kagyu school, was a particularly practitioner of Hevajra. But in Sakya, our most commonly practiced Hevajra line is that comes from the Siddha Virupa, or as Tibetans would pronounce his name, Burwapa, a 9th century Indian yogin. And he developed the practice as a result, again, of a visionary encounter. And in his case, that was with the goddess who's the consort of Hevajra, a goddess known as Nairatmya, which means non-self, in other words, emptiness itself. And out of that, he through his encounter, Brahpa ascended all the levels to spiritual realization, and then distilled his understanding of the Dharma in a short work known as The Path in Its Fruit, or Lamdre, The Path in Its Fruit, or The Path in Its Result, which is very short, but it's extremely compendious. So the Lamdre is, so to speak, the instructions, and Hevajra is the deity to be practiced. That's how we see the 2 and their interrelationship in the Sakya tradition. If you want to practice Hevajra, you receive it as part of the overall transmission of the Lamdre. And the Lamdre is unique teaching to Sakya. It does not exist in the other traditions. So to talk about Hevajra and Lamdre is really, in a sense, to talk about one cycle of one unified cycle of practice. And it was the text came from the teaching came from Buruapa, transmitted through 4 Indian yogins before it reached Tibet in the 11th century, and then through 3 Tibetan masters. Finally, it reached Sachen Kungin Rinpo, the first of the great founding masters of Sakya, who was born in 1092, and so it was at the core of his spiritual life, his core spiritual practice and teaching, and he gave it to a lot of his disciples, and they're the ones who wrote down Sachin's instructions. So we have 11 commentaries on the root verses of the Lamdre, composed by Sachen Kungin Rinpo and written down by his disciples. So the manual, they're the original manuals of the Lamdre system of practice. And then over time, many other works were composed to elucidate the meditation, to elucidate the view, and so on. Because the Lamdre is everything, in the sense that it's the view. It explains to us how to meditate on the view, how to meditate on the true nature of mind, how that true nature of mind is the mind is the basis of all phenomena external and internal, and nothing more than the mind itself. But the mind has no solidity, its nature is emptiness, although its characteristic is luminosity or clarity, through which all appearances manifest. And these two, the emptiness and the luminosity of mind, are actually not separate things. They're one in essence. And that is why we can say samsara and nirvana are actually not different things. It's not that samsara is something we can throw away and then discover nirvana in its place. Samsara originates because we don't recognize the true nature of mind. All samsara is just projections of mind, and therefore it's just mind's luminosity or clarity manifesting in these different shapes, these different forms. So if you try to, as it were, reject samsara and escape from it, as might be taught in the common vehicles, you can't find nirvana, because nirvana is just what samsara is in reality, nothing more than the luminous emptiness of mind. So don't reject samsara to attain nirvana. Samsara's real nature is nirvana. That is how Buddhahood is found in this very moment, in this very life. And that is the key view that is taught for us. If we want to practice the Lamdre, we are taught that view to support our practice. And it is at the same time what is realized, what we finally come to realize, not just intellectually, but experientially, through practicing the cycle of Hevajra meditation. Its preliminaries, its development stage, and its completion stage. So usually when we approach the Lamdre, what we do, we begin with a kind of common teaching, explaining the teachings from a non-tantric perspective in terms of what is called the 3 visions. And that creates in us a certain renunciation, a certain kind of compassionate motivation, and an enthusiasm to enter the Vajrayana, to become Buddhas as swiftly as possible. And then after that, we're given the initiation of Hevajra, the major initiation of Hevajra, both causal and path initiation. And with that, we can meditate on this view that I've just explained briefly, the kodiyame, the inseparability of samsara and nirvana, and we can practice the 10 limbs of the Hevajra sadhana. Part of that sadhana is to do the preliminaries at the beginning. So in other traditions, for instance, and in Vajrayogini too, we find that the beginning of a sadhana comprises repeated practice of refuge and bodhicitta, combined with prostrations, a meditation of the deity Vajrasattva to remove impurities, offerings of the mandala to accumulate merit, and practice of devotion to the line of lamas to receive blessing and to strengthen and maintain the blessing received in initiations. So those nundro, or preliminaries as we call them, are found in the Hevajra sadhana at the beginning, as they're found in the beginning of the Vajrayogini sadhana. In other traditions, like Kaju, the nundro often is practiced simply alone by itself. But in Sakya, it's always practiced as part of these major sadhanas. So then with that, then we can, as I say, practice the major parts of the practice, the development stage of Hevajra, which is both Hevajra and the goddess, Naratmir together, and the 8 attendant goddesses. They're all cultivated in the main development stage. And then after that, we can practice the completion stage yogas. Again, as I explained with Vajrayogini, they're systems of practice that concentrate on the inner energies within our subtle body. Because the subtle body comprised of winds, which are mental energy, drops, which are the male and female potentials, and the channels along which they course. Just as our mind is now affected by dualism, so we have the division of subject-object, so the energies, enlightened energies within our body are divided up and manifested in pure ways as the winds, the drops, and the channels. So the completion stage yogas, like for instance the meditation known as tumo or chandali in Sanskrit, are ways of healing that split within our subtle energies. And by healing that split, bringing all the winds and drops into the central channel, then we can quickly realize enlightenment or Buddhahood. So this is the completion stage practice from Hevajra. It's quite similar, not identical, but quite similar to that of Vajrayogini. So one might say, well, if it has such incredibly subtle practices that could lead a yogi into enlightenment, why don't we just begin with those? The thing is, it just doesn't work like that. We ourselves, in a way, are not we're not capable enough, we're not relaxed enough, we're not pure enough, we're not grounded enough, we're not wise enough to use the highest practices. So not only do we require guidance and initiation is absolutely indispensable for Vajrayana, but we need to mature our experience gradually. It's like there's a saying in the Tantras, you don't pour lion's milk. I'm not sure if lions really have milk, but that's the metaphor. You don't pour lion's milk into a clay pot. It will break it. So similar, the highest teachings and practices we can't relate to properly as beginner practitioners. So even though the Vajrayana, like Hevajra or Vajrayogini, is said to be the rapid way, it's rapid when you're at the right point that you can use it. It's not beginners. We have to generally progress slowly and stably. And even within these higher practices, they have their own, as I've tried to hint, they have their own kind of stages of development. So, yes, Buddhahood is within us, as Sakya tradition says, and as the other traditions say too, Kagyu, Nimangelo, but we still need a kind of sequential, step-by-step approach to uncovering that Buddha nature, that Buddha potential within us. So from practice, this is just a bare sketch because, like, one of the tags for the Sakya tradition in Tibetan history is they're the owners of the ocean of the Tantras. So there's just so many practices that is possessed and has been passed on by the Sakya lineage lamas, hundreds and hundreds actually. So all I've done is really sketch out what are the most popular and the central practices. But any individual practitioner's own sequence of progress would be somewhat different. It wouldn't absolutely be identical to this. This would just be the main main elements. So I think that's probably enough to give some flavor of Sakya, that you can say, well, now I can identify what is characteristic of Sakya.